The moon has been keeping a secret for 57 years, and 9 nights ago, 4 human beings flew directly through the middle of it. In May of 1969, 3 men in a spacecraft called Apollo 10 passed behind the far side of the moon. Cut off from Earth, no radio, no backup. For about an hour, they were, at that moment, the most isolated human beings who had ever lived. And somewhere in that silence, a sound started bleeding through their headsets. A rising, whistling, almost musical tone. Coming from a place where, by the rules of physics they understood, nothing should have been audible at all. They did not report it when they got home. They buried it for decades. And on April 6th of this year, the crew of Artemis II flew the exact same stretch of sky. This is what those Apollo astronauts heard, why they stayed quiet, and what the question becomes now that 4 more people have just come back from the same place. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how strange the far side of the moon actually is. Most people still call it the dark side, but that is wrong. It gets sunlight just like the near side. What it does not get is us. It does not get our radio. It does not get our voices. The moon itself is a solid wall of rock between that hemisphere and every transmitter on Earth. A natural shield about 3,474 kilometers thick. The moment a spacecraft slides behind it, every frequency humans have ever broadcast simply dies. Television, military radar, cell networks, the background hum of a civilization that never stops talking, all of it gone. It is the quietest place any human being has ever traveled to. And quiet, as Apollo 10 learned, is not the same as empty. Apollo 10 was a dress rehearsal. 2 months before Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, NASA sent Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan to do everything the landing mission would do, except the landing itself. Fly to the moon, enter orbit, undock the lunar module, drop it down to within about 15 kilometers of the surface, then climb back up, redock, and come home. It was supposed to be the routine part of a historic sequence. It was not. When the spacecraft passed behind the moon and lost contact with Houston, the onboard recorders kept running. Stafford and Cernan were inside the lunar module, which they had nicknamed Snoopy. Young was alone in the command module, Charlie Brown. And at some point during that radio blackout, a tone started coming through their headsets. Not a click, not a pop, not the ambient static that astronauts had been trained to ignore. A whistle, oscillating, rising and falling. One of the men describes it on the tape as,
"Yeah, it sounds like, outer space type music."
Outer space type music. You can hear the disbelief in their voices. You can hear them ask each other if they are really hearing it. At one point, one of them says, "Shall we tell them about it?" The other hesitates. "No one will believe us," they say. They did not tell them about it. Not in the debrief, not in the official mission report. The transcripts were eventually declassified in 1973, and the audio went onto NASA's servers in 2012, but almost nobody noticed. It was only in 2016, when the Science Channel built a documentary episode around the recording, that the story reached the public for the first time. When it finally got out, the astronauts were asked the obvious question: why the silence? Why hide something so strange for so long? The answer tells you everything about what being an astronaut in 1969 actually meant. They were afraid of being grounded. NASA had a standing policy that any astronaut who reported a hallucination, an unexplained perception, or any sign of psychological strain could be removed from flight status permanently. A decade of training could end in a single meeting with a flight surgeon. Just one mission earlier, Apollo 9 astronaut Rusty Schweickart had admitted to severe motion sickness in orbit, and he had paid for that honesty with his career in spaceflight. So when three men heard something they could not explain, in a place where nothing should have been audible, they made a calculation. They kept it off the record. They flew the rest of the mission, they came home, and for most of their lives, they did not say a word.
The first three human beings to ever hear that sound chose to carry it alone, rather than risk what telling the truth might cost them. Whatever they heard was strange enough that they believed it could end them. Here is a detail that complicates the story further, and almost nobody outside the historical record talks about it. Apollo 10 was not the only crew that heard the whistle. 2 months later, Apollo 11 flew the same path. When Michael Collins was left alone in the command module while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended to the surface, he heard it too. He wrote about it in his memoir, Carrying the Fire. His description, almost word for word, is "a strange noise in my headset now, an eerie woo-woo sound." The difference was that Collins had been briefed ahead of time. NASA technicians had already worked through the Apollo 10 recordings by the time Apollo 11 launched, and they had given Collins a warning and an explanation before he climbed aboard the rocket. "Had I not been warned about it," Collins wrote, "it would have scared the hell out of me." That single sentence is the quiet heart of the whole story. The most famous astronauts to fly solo around the far side of the moon heard exactly what Apollo 10 heard. And the only thing that kept him calm was being told in advance that a known hardware quirk would make it happen. Other Apollo crews on later missions reported similar tones. Apollo 8, however, did not. And Apollo 8 is the mission that turns this whole question into a real puzzle instead of a ghost story, because it provides the one piece of evidence that actually tests the engineering explanation. Apollo 8 flew to lunar orbit in December of 1968, 5 months before Apollo 10. It was the first crewed mission to ever reach the moon. 3 men, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, spent 20 hours circling the far side and the near side in the command and service module. They did not hear a whistle. They did not report any strange tones. They did not describe anything resembling outer space music. And the reason is sitting right there in the hardware manifest. Apollo 8 did not carry a lunar module. It was a command and service module alone, with 1 VHF radio system, not 2. No second transmitter. No neighboring antenna to create a beat frequency with. The tone that Apollo 10 heard, that Apollo 11 heard, that later missions heard, never appeared on the one lunar flight that had no second radio to produce it. That is the cleanest piece of evidence the interference theory has ever had. It is also the reason most engineers who have worked on Apollo communications hardware consider the mystery effectively solved. 2 transmitters on close frequencies inside a few hundred meters of each other, combined with the unusual reflection properties of flying a few kilometers above rough lunar terrain, equals an audio artifact that sounds like whistling,
because that is what radio beat frequencies sound like to a human ear. Add the psychological weight of being on the far side of the moon, cut off from Earth, in a brand new spacecraft, and the experience scales from a minor audio glitch to something that felt paranormal to the men living it. So what was it? The official NASA explanation, once the story was forced into the open, was exactly this. The command module and the lunar module were flying close to each other, each running its own VHF radio system on similar frequencies. When two transmitters sit near one another and their signals drift into the same narrow band, they can create a beat tone, a kind of oscillating interference that sounds, to a human ear, like a whistle or a musical note. It is a clean theory. It is almost certainly correct. It also is not the whole story. Or at least that is the position held by a small number of people who were in the program and never quite accepted it. Al Worden, the Apollo 15 command module pilot, never did. The Apollo 10 crew knew exactly what their equipment sounded like, Worden said later. If they heard something unusual, there was probably something unusual to hear. No one has ever produced a clean laboratory reproduction of the specific waveform on those tapes using only the VHF interference model. The explanation fits the available evidence. It does not fully close every question. And Eugene Cernan, who would become the last man to walk on the moon during Apollo 17, was asked about the sound decades later. He was careful. He said he did not remember it frightening him at the time. He also never quite said he knew what it was.
Fast forward, April 1st, 2026. For the first time since December of 1972, 4 human beings leave low Earth orbit. The Artemis II mission launches from Kennedy Space Center with Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen on board an Orion capsule they had named Integrity. They are not landing. They are flying a free return trajectory around the moon, a 10-day loop, up, around, back, a modern rehearsal for the surface missions that will follow. On April 6th, 5 days into the flight, they passed behind the moon. They lost contact with Houston, and for the next several minutes, they drifted through the same silence that had surrounded Apollo 10 in 1969, except they went further. At their closest approach, Integrity came within about 4,066 miles of the lunar surface. From there, on the free return arc, they coasted outward, eventually reaching 4,700 miles past the far side, and a total of 252,756 miles from Earth at peak distance. That broke Apollo 13's old record. It made Wiseman, Glover, Cook, and Hansen measurably the 4 humans who had ever been furthest from home. More minutes of silence than any Apollo crew. More distance between them and every human voice on the planet. If anything unusual exists in that region, they had a longer, quieter window to hear it than anyone before. What they saw in that window, we already know. During their closest approach, the sun dipped behind the moon and produced a total solar eclipse that lasted nearly an hour. The far side, already dark, went darker. And for the first time in the history of human spaceflight, astronauts got to look at the unlit surface of the moon with their eyes adapted to near absolute darkness. That is when they started seeing the flashes. Small, white to bluish white. A millisecond each, as Wiseman would later describe them. About as long as a camera shutter opening and closing. Pinpricks of light, in Jeremy Hansen's words, scattered across the dark regolith below them. Micrometeorites slamming into the surface at tens of kilometers per second, vaporizing on impact, producing brief, brilliant pulses that no spacecraft camera was fast enough to catch. The crew counted at least 6. Back in Houston, when the descriptions came through, lunar science lead Kelsey Young has said there were audible screams of delight from the science team. Nobody had expected the crew to see any. They saw 6. That is what the Artemis II crew has publicly said they observed in the silence. Flashes they could describe and quantify. Data that mission scientists could triangulate against orbital satellite records. Science that future lunar bases will depend on, since a pebble moving at 30 kilometers a second can puncture a habitat wall as easily as it vaporizes on impact. What the crew has not said, at least not yet, is anything about sound. Nobody has mentioned a whistle. Nobody has described a tone. Wiseman, Glover, Cook, and Hansen have talked about the eclipse. They have talked about the Earthset, the sight of their home planet disappearing behind the lunar horizon. They have talked about naming 2 craters on the far side, including one for Reed Wiseman's late wife, Carol. They have said the experience left them in awe. On the subject of the one specific thing their predecessors buried for 40 years, they have so far said nothing. That silence can be read 2 ways. Maybe Orion's modern digital radio systems, which run on completely different architecture than the Apollo-era VHF setup, simply never produced the kind of beat tone that generated the 1969 whistle. The interference theory predicts exactly this. Different hardware, no hardware artifact, no tone. Case closed. Or maybe the crew heard something and has not decided yet what to do about it. The old policy, the one that scared Stafford and Young and Cernan into silence, has officially been retired. Astronauts today are told that anomalous observations are scientific data, not disqualifying events. Whether that policy holds when a specific astronaut, with a specific career at stake, has to actually make the call, is a question NASA has never really tested in public. It took the Apollo 10 crew more than 40 years to speak freely about what they heard. The Artemis II crew has been back on Earth for 6 days. Start with the physics we already know. The Moon sits inside Earth's magnetotail for several days every month, a long plume of charged particles that our planet drags behind it through space. When a spacecraft moves through variations in that plasma, charged particles can induce small currents in antennas and exposed metal surfaces. Those currents can be audible. You would hear them as low rushing sounds, clicks, occasionally as tones if the geometry is right. Every Apollo crew almost certainly picked up some of this, and the Artemis II crew almost certainly did too. But plasma noise is broadband and chaotic. It sounds like a river, not a flute. It does not explain a clean, oscillating whistle that changes pitch like a voice. There is also the Moon itself. Apollo 17 seismometers, deployed in 1972, picked up events called moonquakes, and some of the deep ones produce infrasound, vibrations below the range of human hearing. Recent analysis of the old Apollo seismic archive, cross-referenced against observed impact flashes, has identified roughly 1,700 impact-related moonquakes in the historical record. Some were powerful enough to roll boulders downhill. The largest could collapse crater walls. Infrasound from events like those can, under certain conditions, couple into spacecraft structures and create audible resonances inside a pressurized cabin. Could a large moonquake, timed precisely, have driven the Apollo 10 acoustic environment for a few minutes? It is a stretch. The energy levels involved are tiny at the altitudes the crew was flying. It is not impossible. And then there are the answers that are less comfortable. The far side of the Moon has only been mapped in serious detail for the last 20 years. Orbiters have found magnetic anomalies there. patches of crust that still carry residual magnetization from a lunar core that died billions of years ago. Some of those features are strong enough to deflect the solar wind locally, creating small bubbles of unusual plasma behavior that nobody has fully catalogued yet. Whether any of it could translate into audible signals inside a crewed spacecraft is not known. Nobody has run the experiment. Apollo 10 was the experiment. Artemis II, whether the crew realized it or not, was the rerun. If you want to go one step further, into territory current science does not have clean tools for, you can ask the question that the astronauts themselves seem to be asking on the tape. What if the sound was not from their equipment at all? Not in the sense that anyone serious thinks there are voices coming from inside the moon, but in the sense that there are electromagnetic phenomena at frequencies humans rarely listen on, and we have not catalogued most of them yet. Every time a new instrument looks at a familiar object on a new wavelength, it finds something nobody expected. Pulsars, fast radio bursts, the hum of the solar wind hitting the heliopause. Every one of those was, before its discovery, a strange sound coming from somewhere it was not supposed to come from. Imagine being Christina Koch, strapped into a seat inside Integrity, the moon filling your window on one side, Earth gone from sight entirely on the other. The cabin is quiet. The radios are dead. The only voices in the universe within range of your ears are the 3 other humans floating beside you. Below, on the darkened surface, pinpricks of light are flaring and vanishing, each one a rock the size of a fist or a fingernail, disintegrating at 30,000 meters per second. And somewhere in that silence, maybe, a tone starts. Rising, falling. Steady enough to notice, strange enough that you look at the person next to you to see if they heard it too. That is what Apollo 10 described. That is what Apollo 11's lone occupant heard and wrote about in a memoir. Whether it happened again on April 6, 2026, is something only 4 people on Earth currently know, and they have not said. There is a reason this story has traveled. It is not because anyone serious thinks the moon is haunted. It is because it touches something honest about what exploration actually feels like. We imagine our astronauts as technicians with perfect equipment, armored in procedure, shielded from the unknown by checklists and training. The real experience is closer to what Stafford, Young, and Cernan lived through. You go somewhere no human has been. Your equipment does something you cannot explain. You have to decide in real time whether to trust what you are hearing or to trust the system that trained you to doubt it. Whatever you choose, you live with. The far side of the moon is not the darkest place humans have ever been. It is the quietest. And quiet has a way of surfacing things that noise hides. Integrity came back carrying the most sophisticated recording equipment ever flown past the moon on a crewed mission. Its data is now being pulled apart, frame by frame, byte by byte, by engineers at Johnson Space Center. Whatever the crew heard, or did not hear, is on those drives. Whether any of it makes it into the public record depends on what the mission analysis shows, what the astronauts decide to say, and what NASA decides to release. Maybe the archives will come back clean. The VHF interference theory will finally be confirmed, 57 years late, by the absence of the same tone on hardware that cannot produce it. That would be a quiet scientific victory. The kind that rarely makes headlines, but closes a case that has been open since Cernan whispered about outer space music into a voice recorder. Maybe the archives will come back with something instead. A signature that does not match any known source. A frequency nobody predicted. Something that sends engineers back to the 1969 recordings with new questions instead of old answers. Maybe Wiseman Glover, Koch, or Hansen, weeks or months or years from now, will be asked the question directly in an interview and will answer it honestly. Maybe they will say exactly what Cernan used to say, which was nothing in particular, delivered with a careful look. We built a narrative decades ago about what it means to go to the moon. Triumph, technology, mastery, flags and footprints. That narrative has always had a quieter counter-story running underneath it. One the astronauts themselves mostly refused to tell. They were not just visiting a dead rock. They were dipping into a place that did things they could not always account for. Equipment behaved oddly. Instruments picked up signals. Headsets played tones that did not match the engineering diagrams. Micrometeorites punched brief, bright holes in the darkness below them. Most of it got filed under noise. Most of it got filed away. Some of it got passed, crew to crew, as whispered warnings from one lunar traveler to the next, the way Michael Collins was told before he went. Now, for the first time in more than half a century, 4 humans have just returned from that same stretch of silence with better microphones than any crew before them. Whatever is out there behind the moon, it has been there the whole time. We just stopped listening for about 5 decades. 6 days ago, we started again. And if the pattern holds, whatever those 4 people actually experienced in their quiet hour behind the moon, we will not hear all of it today. We may not hear all of it this year. We may have to wait until one of them, a long time from now, decides it is finally safe to say. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.